Hi everyone. This is going to be something a little different, and if it goes well, I'll make more of these. As you may know, my next Disney Villains retrospective is going to be on the Horned King from the Black Cauldron, and the Black Cauldron is a really interesting movie. Even if it wasn't necessarily a success, and even though it has a lot of flaws, I think it's really fascinating. And the thing is, I love a lot of these movies, a lot of these old Disney movies, these animated movies, and I love being able to talk about them in these retrospectives, but it's kind of limited just to the villains. And part of that is because the villains are one of the most interesting aspects, one of my favorite aspects. But there are also a lot of aspects that I don't get to talk about, just because they're not really relevant, and I wanted to try to change that going forward. Now, I'm not going to stop doing the retrospective. This is not going to replace the retrospective by any means. But I wanted to do a thing where I could just watch the movie. All my retrospectives are written in advance. This would be more of an off-the-cuff kind of thing, sort of like a commentary, just talking about, different aspects about different characters, the writing, the music, trivia, critiques, things I just happen to really like. I'm not going to be talking about the Horned King or the villains that much, just because there's going to be an entire video about them coming up, so I might say something like, I'm going to talk about this in the future, or, more on this later, but I've been beating around the bush too much. Let's talk about the movie. So this movie is based on the Chronicles of Prydain series by Lloyd Alexander, and it's 5 books, and my family actually has a collection of them that, if it's not the first American editions, it's a very early edition of them, and we had them for years, and I just never got around to reading them. And I started reading them, I want to say I was in college, so these are books that are at a lower reading level, but they're really, really delightful, and I've been rereading them in anticipation for this next video. I don't think the Disney movie really does them justice, and I recommend that you give them a read, because they're really nice books.
Legend has it, in the mystic land of Prydain, there was once a king so cruel and so evil that even the gods feared him.
I mean, right here in this opening, we have Disney simplifying things greatly with just a story about an evil king who was thrown alive into a cauldron. That's not really how it goes in the book, but I think simplifying it was a smart move, just because you see that sometimes in movies. A movie and a book are very different mediums, and I've seen movies where they give you this very complicated prologue and try to get you to absorb it all at once, and it's often kind of overwhelming, and you're left feeling a little bit confused. I mean, not to say that audiences are stupid or anything, but there's only so much you can process at once, and I like that they just simplified it here and are just going to let the story play out. One little detail I really love is the character design of Dolben's cat. We really only see him in these opening scenes, but I love that he looks like Dolben and has the same big, bushy eyebrows. That's very nice attention to detail.
Oh, Dolben. I was just thinking, what if the war's over and I never had the chance to fight?
I've heard people complaining about Taran, calling him kind of whiny, this, stupid kid that wants to run off into war, and that he doesn't really accomplish that much in this movie without some help. And to some extent that's true. This is the Taran that we see in the first book in the series, the Book of 3. And the thing is that Taran gets to grow as the stories go on. So by the time the 5th book comes around, some mild spoilers, but you probably saw this coming, he gets to be that warrior that he always wanted to be. But we see him grow and learn in each book. And this movie largely just adapts the first 2 books, the Book of 3 and the Black Cauldron, so we don't really get to see that. We don't get to see that truly heroic Taran that emerges at the end. And I'm not sure if they had wanted to do a whole series with these movies if this one did well, because this time Disney wasn't really putting out sequel after sequel like they are now. Goes for a lot of Hollywood right now. So it does feel a little unsatisfying at the end, even though he does accept himself for who he is. Yeah, we're not that satisfied at the end, and that's just more of a problem with how they chose to adapt this rather than a problem with Taran the character. And that's also just how it is with the hero's journey with this kind of story. If you're going to have this character who rises to the occasion and who grows, you have to present the audience with a character who is flawed at the beginning and give them flaws that they can overcome. But then there's sort of that, well, how flawed do we make them? Because if you make them too flawed, then the audience doesn't like them and doesn't care about them and doesn't care if they grow. But if you make them too perfect, then that also turns off the audience. So it's this very, very difficult balance beam that you have to walk. Basically, writing a character like this is easier said than done.
You'd better eat it. Dorby made it especially for you.
I don't think Henwin is supposed to be this cute in the book. This is a very cute pig design they've gone with. And I'm sure that's because, well, it's a Disney movie, marketing, merchandising, and I know this sounds cynical when I say it like that, but I'm really not complaining because she's adorable. Speaking of Henwin, I love this animation of her sort of going into her trance before her vision. I think that's a very nice little touch with her eyes rolling just a little bit. I mean, it's not like it's meant to be funny or anything. It adds into this, it just makes the scene a little bit more mysterious when we're reminded that, oh, this is a pig. She might be an oracular pig, but I don't think she really knows what she's showing either. She just has this gift that she's been blessed with. As you might know, this is reused animation from Night on Bald Mountain, and Disney was kind of coming away from using reused animation. Wooly Reithman really liked to do that, and you see that, I think, probably at its worst in Robin Hood, most infamously, but there's a lot in other animated films from the 70s, and I think now that Reithman's not really working with them anymore, they're more okay moving away from that. But, you know, if you have this nice bit of animation, I feel like they get away with it here because it's already such an abstract image. We really don't see the Horned King on a horse, or whatever he's supposed to be riding on there in the movie. And I know there's this whole deleted opening sequence that I've seen storyboards of where they ransack a village, the Horned King and his men, and we see the fair folk flying away and hiding underground. And I think that would be really effective. And I guess that's something to bring up here, is all this deleted footage from the movie, because they deleted a bunch of completed scenes or largely trimmed them down. Yesterworld did a really good video about this missing footage and looked at all these storyboards of what was sort of a mock-up of the final movie. And a lot of the things that they cut were fairly minor. A lot of Fluter had a lot of lines that were cut. There were a lot of small details, fairly inconsequential scenes for the most part. Sounds like Katzenberg just got very happy with the pair of scissors. And some deleted scenes that have been talked about online, I think, are just fabrications. There's talk about a scene of Taran hacking someone to bits with his sword. There's talk of a scene where something happens to Eilonwy's clothes that is sort of scandalous, and that just sounds like a really unpleasant rumor. I hope that's just an urban legend. And I don't think we're ever going to know the full story, but on the DVD there is one, count them, one deleted scene, and it's an alternate version of Meeting the Fair Folk. And it's totally an alternate scene with a different design and persona for King Eileg and for Doli. And there's no information about when this was animated, because there's also, they have the scene with them talking to Gurgi before that is pretty much the same scene, but there's just some longer dialogue that's been cut down. So it's one of those things where it's really frustrating, because on one hand, we have an idea of how a lot of scenes were just more trimmed down than anything, but then we're presented with a scene that's completely different, and there's no information about when this was animated or why it was changed. It's really frustrating, because there are a lot of people who want to know about this movie and about these details, but for whatever reason, Disney is just not really interested in putting that information out there, and there's an audience for this. Like, I know Disney Plus has been having some problems with retaining viewership lately, and I think it would be really cool if they put more stuff like this, more work prints, more commentaries, more information in general. And I don't know if that would, raise the audience to the extent that they want, but I think it would still get more people. But what do I know? I'm just a nerd making these Disney history videos, right?
Oh, yes. Yes, my soldiers.
I'll be talking about this more in the Horned King video, but the first time we see the Horned King, that is not what we were supposed to see. This scene was supposed to come much later in the movie, between the Fair Folk scene and the Morva scene, and I feel like this was... I don't want to blame Katzenberg for everything, but this was definitely an executive choice, and I think they wanted to show the villain earlier, but I think that kind of robs us of the impact of when the Horned King makes his actual entrance in what should have been his first scene. And I know that a movie that came out the same year as this, and had a number of its own production problems, was Legend. And if you watch the original director's cut, the Darkness, the big Tim Curry demon, we only see him we see his hand and we see him in shadows for a good part of the movie before we get a proper look at him. But in the theatrical cut that was the most available one in the United States for a long time, we see his face almost immediately. And I think it takes away from the impact, but I think there's also this need to retain the audience's attention, and I think that is why we have the Horned King show up so much earlier than he really should in this scene.
A true hero!
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
When Taran is seeing the vision of him as a hero, the music that is playing in the background is a quote from Fanfare for the Common Man by Aaron Copland. The movie's composer, Elmer Bernstein, was actually a student of Copland, which is why Bernstein wrote a lot of Americana music for movies like The Magnificent Seven and To Kill a Mockingbird, and many, many others. And the year before this, Bernstein had done music for Ghostbusters, and there are a lot of parts in this score that sound like his work on Ghostbusters.
Thank you all. But without the help of my pig Henwin here, Henwin?
Oh, Taran, you had one job. I just wonder how fast this pig is, or how long he was out, because that fantasy did not take very long, and she's just gone. Another detail I really appreciate is how the mood changes so much once Henwin is gone. Suddenly the forest is a little darker, you can see some scary faces on the trees. Taran he was so sure of himself a second ago, and now he is just this lost kid. You know, it's the little things like that that really help elevate this movie that had a lot of problems, but you can find quality in here when you look.
Good, Prince. Good apple. Oh boy, what a juicy apple.
Oh, and here comes Gurgi. People are so mean to Gurgi. I think he gets a lot of hate, and I don't know if I just have a higher tolerance for this kind of character. I don't mind him. I think he's cute. He's not the greatest comic relief character, but his speech pattern is really cute, and that's carried over directly from the book. In the book, Gurgi is a little larger, and I'll be honest, he is more useful, but his talk of munchings and crunchings and smackings and whackings is taken straight from the book. I think that if nothing else, they got Gurgi's voice down, and oh, and what a voice he has! This is such a wonderful, distinct voice they've given poor little Gurgi. Sorry, I don't know where that came from.
Hold on, you hairy little thief. Come back with my apple. If you don't give it back, you'll be sorry.
I feel like this whole bit with the apple, Taran ends up coming off as kind of a bully. I mean, Gurgi does take the apple, but really at this point, Taran should be just looking for the pig. He should not be wasting his time with this little fuzzy imp. But I think it's just because Taran is probably mad at himself for losing Henwin, and it's one of those things where he's trying to save face somehow, and, you know, he wants to be this warrior, and if he lets just this little forest thing get the best of him, well, what kind of warrior is he? So it's a little annoying in the moment, but if you think about who Taran is, what he wants, and where he is as a person right now, it makes sense. There's some really cool shots in this chase scene. I love the shot of Henwin being chased through the field. I don't know if they used computers on this or what, some early... because I know there was some early use of CGI in this movie. And I remember seeing this as a kid, and seeing just a tiny bit of blood on Taran's face in this moment, and just being disturbed at just the presence of blood in a Disney movie. And this is a trickle, this is nothing, and I guess I forgot that you see some on Maleficent in that fight scene when she's a dragon. I guess they could get away with that. But just the tiniest presence of blood, I think, is a good indicator that they were trying to do something dark or something. I mean, this was the first PG animated Disney film, and this was a big risk for the company. And I think that it was because they were... I mean, if you listen to the interview I did with Jerry Reese about his work on The Fox and the Hound, you'll know that Disney was in this really weird place in the 80s where you had movies like Return to Oz and Something Wicked This Way Comes, where they wanted to try to do something different, a little more adult. Oh, Watcher in the Woods, that's another one. But then at the same time, they got cold feet. They'd appear to get cold feet halfway through and end up largely toning down big parts of these movies. So you end up with a movie that I don't think the movie even really knows what it's doing or who it's for. And I'm not criticizing these movies. I mean, they're good. But you had Watcher in the Woods that had this really cool creature and this cool ending that didn't make it into the original release, and you had a lot of reshoots for Something Wicked, and then they threw out the old score by Georges Delerue and had James Horner write a new score, and it was good, but it wasn't as good. And you just had this company that was constantly jumping between, we want to try something new, we want to try something darker, more adult, and oh, but wait, we're Disney. And it makes this a really fascinating time historically, but a really frustrating time as a member of the audience.
No, great lord. Not going there. Forget the piggy.
What are you doing here?
Gurgi come back to be your friend.
And once again, we have Gurgi. And I have to say, I really like what they did with Gurgi as a character. And I know a lot of people will disagree with me, but I think he's really interesting because we have this guy who really wants friendship and really wants to belong somewhere. But he's also very greedy, very cowardly, very impulsive. And he has a lot of trouble reconciling his positive and negative aspects. And that's, of course, that comes to the head at the end of the movie where Gurgi ends up being the hero. But it's kind of the same problem I was talking about Taran at the beginning. It's sort of, if you want this character to grow, how flawed are you willing to make them? And more importantly, how many flaws are the audience willing to accept? And I guess they dropped the ball with Gurgi, but I think I'm a Gurgi apologist. I love this crumbling castle. This is a great set piece. This is just a grungy work of art. I actually like horror movies a lot, but I am not big on jump scares. I do not appreciate this guard dog. One thing I do appreciate is this really funky music they have playing during the party scene.
Come on! Here!
I don't even know how to describe this music, but it's a very distinct piece. If anybody knows what you could call this genre, please let me know.
Keep your hands off, little creeper!
And we get our first view of Creeper, and we see where he is on the social food chain. This poor little guy. I'm going to have a lot to say about Creeper. And then we've got this dancing woman who completely disappears after this scene. This is her only moment. I think we see her in the credits dancing with Creeper, and getting cheered on, too, by the other guys, which is a weirdly sweet little image. Just, Creeper having this one moment of being happy and being cheered on and being accepted. But I kind of wonder where she is for most of this movie. Maybe it's better not to know.
I presume, my boy, you are the keeper of this oracular pig.
There is so much to say about the Horned King, and I'm kind of relieved I don't have to say it all here. But I will say that he is a cult favorite. I mean, this movie is a cult favorite, but this character, people love the Horned King because he's so dark and so scary and so different. And on one hand, I totally get that, and I love his design, I love his voice. But I think that there's a lot of aspects where they kind of drop the ball on him. It's a little confusing, and I'm just know that there is a lot to be said about this Horned King. So this moment right here, when the Horned King gets in the camera and he's got the red eyes, this was meant to be our first really good look at just how gruesome this character was. That is, of course, spoiled by having the scene that was meant to come later come earlier. I gotta wonder what that liquid is and why it's burning him. Because it does not affect Henwin, so I'm wondering if Henwin's oracular nature somehow makes it scalding hot, or if perhaps it's some sort of holy water and that's why the Horned King can't touch it, or maybe he's just really averse to water in general. But I've wondered that for years. And so here we have the entrance of Princess Ailanwi, who is probably one of the most forgotten Disney princesses. I think Kita was pretty forgotten for a time, and she still is to an extent, but people are starting to come around to her, which, they should. But poor Eilonwy. And I get why people forget her, and it's a real shame because the book version of Eilonwy is this really funny, interesting, capable character, and she's probably one of my favorite characters in the whole series, and none of that is really reflected in this character here. I think they kind of dropped the ball with her. I mean, nowadays, especially in the remakes, there is this effort to make the princesses a lot more affirmative, and sometimes I think that might be to the detriment of the story, or just the specific story they're telling, but it's really funny that, there's such a big push to make Ariel and Snow White these really strong characters who, and they're both strong in their own way, but Eilonwy, meanwhile, was this very strong character, and they just dropped the ball with her. Speaking of balls, she has that bauble in this. The bauble actually plays a very big role in the books, but here it's just this sort of floating sidekick thing, and it just kind of comes in and out. Like, there are a few scenes early on where she has it, and it's accompanying her, but then it disappears. But then it shows up again later, and it just kind of appears and disappears in sort of a game of when the animators remember to include it. Reminds me a little bit of how in American Tail, they just forgot about Fievel's baby sister at some point, and she just disappears. But the bauble comes and goes. It's funny. And then we get this moment here with Creeper and this guy who has all the bodies on the cart. And again, we've kind of been spoiled by what this is because they took that scene with the Horned King looking over the skeletons that was meant to come much later in the movie and moved it up earlier. I think this is a nice little look at Creeper's character here because we have, him having this one moment of power bossing this big guy around, this guy who could probably squash him, but he's doing his job. And so you see that Creeper is not really an angel. He has so little power that when he has a chance to lord it over somebody else, he's very unsympathetic, he's very nasty about it. I think you see a similar thing with LeFou in Beauty and the Beast in the few moments when he's kind of sadistic toward the objects. He's a pretty miserable little character, but we love him anyway. One of the directors in this movie was Richard Rich, who went on to have an animation career of his own outside of Disney. I think he's best known for doing the Swan Princess movies, and there are a lot of those. And if you watch enough Richard Rich movies, you start to see that there are definitely things he likes. He likes dancing animation, anachronistic humor, and smart alecky animal sidekicks. And while I don't really think anyone in this movie is terribly smart alecky, I feel like Creeper and Dolly feel very much like characters who you would find in a Swan Princess movie. Gurgi a little less so. But Creeper and Dolly feel very at home in Richard Rich's world. I really don't know how much he had to do with the general direction of this movie, though, because this movie went through so many issues and problems. I know he was sort of, from what I recall, or from what I've read, he was sort of thrust into the co-director role of Fox and the Hound after Don Bluth left with his people. And I wonder if there's a similar sort of thing with Black Cauldron, because he left Disney after Black Cauldron, and I don't know if the problems with this movie are entirely his fault. Feels like he might have been kind of thrown under the bus. I'm really not sure. Now, I know I talked about how Eilonwy was done dirty by Disney, and how the book version of Eilonwy is just a much better character. I could really say the same thing about Fluter. He still has a lot of bravado and bumblingness in the books, but he's much more capable, and he also has like a giant cat that he gets later on who really likes his music. There's a lot of really fun stuff with Fluter, but I feel like his personality, at the very least, comes through in this movie, with the running gag about how whenever he stretches the truth, one of his harp strings will break. That's straight from the book, actually. So I feel like although Fluter does not get treated that well in this movie either, I think that he is closer to his book counterpart than poor Eilonwy.
Pig boy! You little scut!
I like that after Creeper calls Terran Pig Boy once, that just kind of becomes his nickname by all of the guards. There is a character in the second book, The Black Cauldron, who calls him Pig Boy, but well, I hesitate to call him a hero, but he's more on Terran's side than these guys. This is a really fun sequence, and even though Terran is, kind of having his hand held the whole time with the magic sword, it's really fun to give him just this one moment of feeling like a real hero. And, we've got the really wonderful swashbuckling music. I wish they still wrote music like this for movies. You really don't hear this as much. This is really harkening back to the golden age of Hollywood, and I miss it. I think the music contributes a big part to the enjoyability of this scene. Okay, so this one is a nitpick, and it's a minor one, but it's one that I always notice, and if you haven't, then you're going to now. It's this shot here when we see Creeper leading the guys, and we pan up, and the background changes before it should, so for a second it looks like Creeper's running on the sky. It's just a little bit faster than the characters in the camera. And, it's not like one of these things, oh, movie ruined, cinema sin, whatever. It does not ruin the movie, but it takes me out for 1 second, and it's just one of those things that I always notice. Oh no, am I becoming the guy from Animaniacs, the please, please, please get a life guy? I feel like every year I feel a little more called out by that sketch. I love this pan here, where we can just really take in how dirty and nasty this castle is. And I like this little moment we get alone with Creeper, that just to remind us how miserable this poor guy's life is.
The world will applaud me, its praise will reward me, and I, Fluda Flam, will find fame.
So when we rejoin our heroes, we see that Fluter is singing. And Black Cauldron is a milestone in a way because it is the first animated Disney movie to not have a song sung by anybody. Even Fantasia had Ave Maria at the end, but this one does not have a song sung by a character or an off-screen singer like Bambi. There's no song, but technically there's this one, but I don't know if it counts. I mean, Richard Rich actually did write a song for it called Fluter's Song. This might be the song that we're hearing, but I think it was supposed to be longer at some point. And I would love to follow up on this, but I can't. There is a series of books called Disney's Lost Chords that are full of cut Disney songs, and they have sheet music, and the problem is these books are incredibly hard to come across. It was a very limited printing, and finding them online, they're ludicrously expensive, and I don't really want to put down a bunch of money on... I mean, it's going to be an interesting book, but I don't think I really want to put down that money just to confirm if these 2 lines that Fluter sings were part of a bigger song written by Richard Rich.
Silly girl. Even if she is a princess.
This is the scene that I could do without. The part where Terran and Eilonwy have their little argument and then reconcile. Because they'd have moments kind of like this in the books, but here it feels like the emotion's a little too forced. And I know that a big part of just any kind of storytelling is manipulating the audience's emotions, but you have to do it and not be so transparent. If we realize that our emotions are being manipulated, that's when you check out. And here it's just something about the dialogue just being a little clunky, the whole conflict feeling a little bit manufactured, and the resolution also feeling a little forced. I think it's just forced enough to make us go, hey, we're watching a movie. And it's one of those things that just pulls you out. Another problem is that this version of Terran and Eilonwy are not nearly as interesting or engaging as their book counterparts. So I don't dislike them, but I also don't truly like them as much as I should. So maybe the problem is not just in the writing of the scene, but just in these characters being a little blander than they really should be.
This want this?
Go ahead. I'm sure you've murdered for less.
But that is followed up by Gurgi at his Gurgiest. I like Gurgi, but I can't help but being just as pissed off at him as Taran is in this moment, as he's accidentally strangling poor Fluter. But even in this moment, it's pretty funny, with Fluter being much more frightened by Gurgi than he should be. I won't say that this movie does not handle its comedy pretty well. I like these shots of them traveling, and we don't really get too many, which is too bad. I feel like we never really get to know Prydain all that much. It feels very empty, this movie. Because we see there are plenty of characters, the fair folk, the guards, but we don't really see any people just, living and going about their daily lives. I mean, all those skeletons obviously had to come from somewhere, but I wish we could have maybe gotten that scene of the village being ransacked, because I would have liked to just see more of just the average villager, the average Prydain citizen, to kind of put the Horned King's plan into a broader scope, where we can see just how many people will be affected by the Cauldron-born if they are allowed to go forward. As it is, most of the time we just see these very pretty but kind of empty forest shots. And just to be clear, I know that I'm doing a lot of critiquing, and maybe some of this is nitpicking, and I don't mean any disrespect toward anyone who's worked on this, because I think there's a lot of very nice animation and good music. Actors who did the best they could with some of these characters, and when the writing is good, it's good. And I know that all of these critiques that I'm making from here, from many years in the future, and hindsight is one of those things that, in those moments, there could be a lot of reasons why they weren't able to make these decisions, especially given just the crazy production. So just if there's anyone who worked on this movie, or any of the movies or series that I talk about, I just hope you know that even when I am being critical toward them, I respect the work you guys do, because especially just on an individual level, it's not a thankless job, but it's not always a job that you properly get credited or thanked for. So just know that even when I'm being critical, I appreciate all your work.
You better tell King Idleleg.
You silly. You know we're not supposed to be up here.
These little kids remind me a lot of the kids from Robin Hood, especially with, the little girl, and her voice delivery reminds me a lot of Tagalong, the littlest bunny. And it's very cute, and I'm glad it's small doses. I think it works best in small doses. And Dolly is another character who, he's kind of like the character in the book, but also kind of not. I wish he had a little more to do, because he just kind of disappears once they introduce him. He's kind of like Ilanwi's Bauble, except he talks. I know there's a Dolly plush out there, one of those little beanbags they used to sell in the Disney catalog. Oh, that takes me back. But for some reason they didn't include his beard, and he looks like a totally different character without his beard. I think the beard makes him a little cuter. I think the doll would look better with a beard. I love the theme for the fair folk, the da-da-da-da-da-da. It's nice to have some, after all the dark stuff we've gotten with the Horned King, it's really nice to have this really colorful moment with these cute characters and this really joyous music playing. And as you might be aware, you can see Tinkerbell in the crowd, and I think they repeat her a few times. And the only difference is this Tinkerbell, because she's one of the fair folk, she has a little antenna on her head that she did not have anywhere else. And here we have King Idleleg, who is a lot more... He's not a bad guy in the books by any means, but he's a harsher character. He's a lot more suspicious of these outsiders. And you can see that in the alternate deleted scene. They actually were a lot closer to the book in this version, and they also had Dolly having trouble becoming invisible, which is, again, something from the book that we don't see in the movie. It's kind of uncanny how much he's like the Sultan in Aladdin. That, that roly-poly ruler who is really sweet, but not really that effective. I mean, even his voice is kind of similar. And then, Aladdin was in production, it came out the same year, Ferngully had another character like this, and he's maybe even more like Idleleg because he's also a fairy. So if nothing else, I feel like, I don't know if he started this little archetype, but I think he could have been an influence on Aladdin later on. If anyone is wondering, I am going to include the witches as villains in this video. In the book, they're a lot more nuanced, and they're really not heroes or villains. But here, the witches are a lot more malicious. They're really looking to rip Taran off to get the sword and the cauldron. And in the book, the situation is, again, a little more complicated and nuanced. And that's not complaining. I think the witches are very fun here. Even if they went in a more basic good versus evil kind of thing, they're really delightful characters. I'm a little curious about that symbol on their door. I know when they did Princess and the Frog, they wanted to have things that look like voodoo symbols for Facilier, but they didn't want to actually use any, so they had to sort of come up with their own abstract designs. And I'm wondering if this is a real symbol, or if this is, again, something abstract. I know I'm asking a lot of the people in the comments, but again, I'm curious if you know your occult, your voodoo. As you can probably tell from me talking about this, I really don't. But if this symbol on their door is anything, I'm curious.
Where'd he go? You!
Yeah, I'm sure someone had some sort of awakening watching this. You just know.
It's a trick. We're not going to let them have it, are we?
Don't worry.
One of my favorite little pieces of character animation is right here when Orgoch just pops right into frame. She comes off as like very paranoid, very, very conspiratory. I love when characters do that, and it's just such a dynamic pose and a wonderful little piece of animation. In fact, I just love the poses and the characterization of these witches in general. They're so theatrical, they're so much fun. I wish there was more of them in this movie. I wish they did something more with them. They remind me a lot of the Hocus Pocus witches. And, there's a crossover I'd love to see that is probably never going to happen, but I don't know, you never know. But I'd love to see something more with these characters because they don't really have much screen time, but the personalities are just so distinct, and the performances are so good. I think the witches absolutely steal the show, and everyone who worked on them should be very proud of themselves.
Gurgi will trade his punchings and munchings.
Who would want...
Hold it, sister! Not so fast!
So I am not a lawyer, I don't have any real legal knowledge about this sort of thing, but Gurgi did offer his munchings and crunchings, and Orgoch did take it, so technically he should get the cauldron. I know one of the deleted scenes that Yesterworld mentioned was a part when they try to destroy the cauldron, and you can actually see the jump cut. You can see the characters' positions have changed when the scene has been taken out. I don't know why they cut that. Again, there's a lot of rumors that the scenes were cut for being too scary, and, you know, that scene, that really infamous, gruesome scene with the guy being dissolved, yeah, I can see why they cut that. But this is, I guess it's intense, but it's not PG intense. I don't know why they made some of these decisions. It seems like a lot of the cuts in this movie weren't really for the content, but just really the haphazard whims of Katzenberg. So it's again one of those mysteries.
I say, what funny little ducklings! Don't they know the Black Cauldron is indestructible?
Again, some wonderful animation and poses on the witches. You have Ordu just casually smacking Orgoch around, and you've got Orwen lounging, trying to look seductive. So much great characterization. This is the kind of stuff that I really love in animated films.
Look, you are somebody. You must believe in yourself. I believe in you.
You do?
I know I was complaining about the first emotional moment with Taran and Eilonwy in the forest, but I think this scene when, his spirits are at his lowest and she is there for him, I think this is a genuinely sweet little scene. And I know, Disney is capable of doing even sweeter and even more emotionally fulfilling scenes, but for what it is, I think this is a nice little moment. The da-da-da-da-da theme for Eilonwy is also really nice. Although, there's another one of those things I can't unhear. I think it was called the Disney Odyssey. It was a website that, one of those many websites where people talk about all the movies, and they mentioned that the melody for her theme is very similar to a West End musical, Blood Brothers. There's a song called Tell Me It's Not True, and they are very similar.
just a story.
And they did come out around the same time, so I don't know if Elmer Bernstein had heard the musical. And again, sometimes there are only so many musical notes and combinations out there. Sometimes songs will just sound similar. I know one of the themes John Williams wrote for the Abraham Lincoln movie bears this uncanny resemblance to a theme Randy Newman wrote for A Bug's Life. So sometimes that's just how it happens, but it's one of those things that's very hard to unhear, and now you can't unhear it either. I know this moment where Gurgi abandons his friends is meant to be one of those, oh, Gurgi, you little jerk. Let's be real, him abandoning them allowed him to come back for them later and save them, and save everybody. I guess if he was truly a coward and a bad friend, he would have left them, but the fact that he sneaks into the Horned King's castle himself says a lot about Gurgi, and it's something where I think he does deserve a little more credit than a lot of people give him. And here is where it really just becomes a straight-up horror movie. I think this is very close with Night on Bald Mountain for some of Disney's just unapologetically darkest imagery. And I am all for that. I know it's not for everyone, but there's some really visceral imagery in here, some really wonderful Halloween kind of stuff. I think you have to be in the right mood for this movie, but as I've said before, when it works, it works. And I also love just the panic of the human warriors here when they realize just how expendable they are. I believe this might be CGI for the mist, and I know the scene where the mist dissolves the guy was cut, but I like that they show Gurgi going out of his way not to touch it. And Gurgi didn't see this guy die, but he just, I guess it's his animal side that he just instinctively knows not to touch this.
Taran has many friends. Gurgi has no friends.
Gurgi! No!
And yeah, I can understand why people find this unsatisfying, since we have this whole story about this kid who has these dreams and visions of being this great hero, and he's never truly able to rise to the occasion. He has a magic sword that helps him escape, and then, he gets ripped off by some witches, and then the ultimate heroic sacrifice, the big moment, is given to the sidekick. I think for what it's worth, they do an okay job with this, because Taran accepts himself for who he is at the end. He turns down the sword, he just wants Gurgi back, and that's a very noble request in and of itself. It shows the real hero spirit inside Taran, and that it's not for the glory anymore, but for the friendship. In the books, where Taran is allowed to go on to become that hero. And the implication here is that he will, but there's not really the same confirmation we get as the really well-developed character in the books. So yeah, I understand why this movie might leave some people feeling a little cold and unsatisfied. That being said, I think the Horned King does get one of the most gruesome Disney deaths. They might have cut the guy getting dissolved, but we do get to see the Horned King's skin get ripped off. So that's something.
Oh, sire. He's gone. He's gone.
I love the send-off Creeper gets, too. He gets his own little private moment of ding-dong, the witch is dead, and Creeper's a little jerk himself, but we can't help but be happy with him and laugh with him and celebrate with him. Him holding the horns as he goes, it's really... That is very satisfying.
Stay your hand, ladies. We never give anything away. We bargain. We trade.
Poor Fluter has been so useless in this movie, and again, he's a much more capable character in the books. But I really love this moment he has here where he is able to play the witches. Just, a moment that basically justifies his role in the plot, period.
The cauldron? For Gurgi.
Dear.
It's not possible.
I'm sure some people are probably wondering, well, if the witches can't bring Gurgi back, or they say they can't, then how come they can? Because they seem to honestly mean that they can't bring him back, and then after Fluter goads them into it, they do. And I've been thinking about that for a while, and I think the answer is, it's not that they can't, necessarily, in a literal sense, but it's more that they're not really allowed to. that they are very powerful magical figures, but there is some sort of higher power that does not allow them to do this, that even they can't disobey, and is ultimately Fluter really egging them on that gets them to break these rules. That's just a theory, though. That's the best I can come up with. And again, it's kind of a plot hole, but it comes so late in the movie, and we all knew Gurgi was going to be okay, so it doesn't really spoil the experience for me. It's one of those things where it's fun to speculate about.
Munchings and crunchings in here somewhere.
Gurgi!
And I do love that when Gurgi, when he comes back to life, the first thing he does is, almost just by instinct, try to get some food off of Terran. It's very in character, and Gurgi, our heroic little hero, finally gets what he's always really wanted, which is a home and friends. And I know this is kind of on the cliché side, but, I always say they're clichés for a reason. Yeah, you can take a step back and go, oh, this is so by the numbers, this is so predictable. And to an extent it is. I know I had that problem with Brave. I think after the mom became a bear, I called everything that was going to happen. But at the same time, I still cried a little. It was still, I got caught up in the emotions, and the same thing is here. Even if you know exactly where the story is going, if the movie does it well, if they lean into the emotion, if they make you feel something, then I think they've done a good job. I think that movies in general, and I'm sorry, this has become less about the Black Cauldron, more about movies in general, but I think that movies, I think we've kind of lost sight of that. There's always this sort of wanting to be meta, to wink at the camera, this sort of idea that sometimes it feels like it thinks it's smarter than us, or that we should be smarter than it. I can't quite tell, but you'll have this emotional moment, and then they'll make a joke or something, and it'll pull you out as if to say, oh, I'm sorry, did you actually care about these characters? You know none of this is real, right? And this is not me saying that I don't like comedy. I mean, I think a lot of the praise I've had for this movie is that the funny scenes are done very well. I love comedy. I mean, most of the stuff I've written, this non-YouTube stuff, fictional stuff, has leaned into comedy. But there's a time and place, and I feel like we're losing a lot of those more quiet or just plain emotional moments. I know I'm not the only person who feels this way. And every now and then, a fourth wall break, a meta joke, they're funny, but I think there's just too many of them lately. But that's neither here nor there. We're here to talk about the Black Cauldron, and, everything does get wrapped up nicely, with everybody going home, and Terran getting his own sort of heroic moment by just wanting Gurgi back. I think it works for me. I think it works okay. And for what it is, for all the flaws that this movie does have with story choices, and for all those, haphazard cuts, and all the production problems, and for this, for that, I think it works okay. This is not a perfect movie. And even if we had gotten the uncut version, and I'd love to see the uncut version, but I feel like even if there were no cuts, I don't know how much it would have helped. And I feel kind of bad saying that. But I think that the movie's, the flaws that we've discussed are more than just a couple scenes can really make up for. I think the story has problems. But that being said, I still like this movie. It's offbeat. And it comes at a very interesting time in Disney's history, in a very distinct period. And there was clearly an effort made. And I feel like, we should do our best to appreciate that effort. And one other thing, I love these credits. I like seeing the epilogue with them coming home, with Dalbin and Fluter getting along. I love the shot of Gurgi and Creeper, the sidekicks. I like Creeper dancing with the lady. I like credits like this. And I don't know if we see these as much. I'm not going to say we don't see these anymore, but I like those epilogue credits. I think Luca did that recently, and that was very sweet. I really like Luca. So I end the Black Cauldron video talking about Luca. So that is my video, my commentary. Got a little rambly, as you can see. This is when I'm, off script. I think that I'm able to explain everything a little more concisely in the scripted videos, but I also like being a little more off the cuff here. And if you liked this, I'm just going to do the typical YouTube ending here. If you liked this kind of video and you want to see more of this, please let me know. And if I do make more like this, again, just to restate, I'm not going to stop making the other kinds of videos, the retrospectives and deep dives. This is not meant to replace that. But this was fun to record, and it's nice to talk about things that I might not be able to as easily in the other videos. So please let me know, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I'm happy that people actually care what I have to say about this, and that's very touching. So I really appreciate all of you. Thank you again, and have a good one.